Hello everybody, let me begin this video by asking a simple question. How often do you change your car? Obviously, as a YouTuber, I'm expected to change mine every hour on the hour. But what about the rest of us? Do you do it every 3 or 4 months? Do you turn over stuff pretty quickly as soon as you get bored? Or do you keep it for the full year, maybe 2, perhaps even 3? In any case, I think it would have to be a very, very special car for someone to keep a hold of it for 10 years. And that's exactly how long this car's owner, Duncan, has had his Porsche 911 997.1 Carrera 2S. Let's see if there's a good reason for it. I must confess that I have been waiting to drive one of these cars for a very, very long time. The 997.1 C2S has a very special place in my heart because a long time ago my father bought one. It was in fact one of the very first 997s delivered to the country, and we were the ones who delivered it because on the 21st of January 2005 he and I collected the car from Stuttgart. That, as a 15-year-old lad, was the best thing ever. Regrettably, for various reasons, it seems now that very few people are ever going to have the opportunity to do something like that again, particularly for those of us living in Britain. But I'm glad I got the chance when we still could. Before I'd even started my YouTube career, I was very lucky in that I got to drive an awful lot of very nice cars through friends and contacts at dealerships, so on and so forth. However, I'm not sure I've actually ever driven one of these. I know that I've driven a bunch of 997.1s, including some of the spicy versions, the Turbo and the GT3. I've driven 997.2 in many guises, but I couldn't actually recall ever having sampled the one that meant the most to me, the C2S. A few months ago, I mentioned this in a video, and a whole bunch of people got in touch and offered me their cars for review. So if you're one of those people, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for the offer. Obviously, there was only one car I could actually review. Unfortunately, that car actually then turned out to be unavailable, so this car's owner, Duncan, stepped in and offered me his. This is a bone standard midnight blue late 2005 example with just over 41,000 miles on the clock. Though the number down here isn't particularly large, the miles added to this car have all been enjoyable. In its early days, he even took it on track a number of times, though now he uses it simply for weekend blasts, occasional jaunts, and just having a little bit of fun. He also has access to a couple of other cars in this sort of price bracket from both Audi and BMW. But when it comes to the Porsche, he said that nothing else has really ever come along that can beat this car's combination of talents. It is for him the perfect balance of size, power, weight, and driver involvement. All qualities I very much admire. But before we give the car some stick, I'll tell you a little bit about the 997, but if you don't want to hear any of that, or you know it all already, skip to the next chapter, which I'll try and remember to do on this video. In terms of automotive rebirths, the 997 generation of 911 must be up there alongside the Ferrari F355, because in both cases, a manufacturer took an almost universally unloved model, for Ferrari the 348, for Porsche the 996, made what was actually only relatively minor mechanical changes, and ended up with one of their most loved. So, the 355 underneath is very much a 348. Yes, the engine changed quite a bit, but generally speaking, if you look at a 348, get rid of the strakes on the side, put 355 wheels on it, smooth it off a little bit, that's a 355. And likewise, the 997 underneath is very, very closely related to the 996. As it happens, the 996 itself is also experiencing something of a renaissance. Whether that's simply a function of increasing prices for the more desirable 911s, or people genuinely beginning to appreciate what it is, I couldn't say. But the fact is, once upon a time you could pick up a pretty decent, if slightly scruffy, 996 for 8 or 9 grand. Those days, it would appear, are quite behind us. A nice 996 C4S used to be sort of 16, 17, 18 grand, and I once even saw a 996 Turbo go for 17 grand. Granted, not the best of examples, and it was being sold in a hurry, but it was a real car that actually went for that money. These days, you can more or less double some of those numbers. The reasons behind people not liking the 996 then and now can be fairly easily summarised. First off, Porsche ditched the traditional round headlight look that had been with the 911 since its inception. It was replaced initially with the very much unloved fried egg headlights that Porsche did rework and eventually turned into something I kind of like, but you cannot argue are not classic 911. Secondly, the interior was pretty low rent. For a car that was not cheap at the time, it wasn't a great place to be, and today they have not aged well. Thirdly, and most criminal of all, they turned out to be quite unreliable, with the engine being particularly problematic, and that was rather expensive to fix if it did go wrong, and go wrong it did. This really was something of a perfect storm, so that's how we wound up in a situation where a 911 would often cost you less than an equivalent M3, or in some cases, the more humdrum opposition like a 350Z or an MX-5. The 997 sought to right those wrongs. We start with a restyling of the exterior, which regained the original round headlights and was all the better for it. At the rear, the car became a little bit chunkier, a little bit broader, and a touch more defined. Even today, a well-presented example of a 997 is a very nice thing to behold. I also want to point out that the 997 C2S is the only place I ever want to see lobster claw wheels. For some reason, the lobster claws that were standard on the 997 C2S and the little weird sort of three-finger things that came on the 997 Turbo appear on just about everything. But they look wrong on just about everything except the car for which they were designed. My father's example was in basalt black. This is in the very subtle but rather alluring midnight blue. It looks very good. The interior also received a dramatic overhaul. This particular example has blue leather that I don't hate anywhere near as much as I should. It's also extended, which really does lift the cab, and you get that as standard I think on some other models but not the lower ones. It makes a huge difference. However, if you were to close your eyes and sit in a 996, then a 997, you would find all the touch points are largely in the same place. And that's no bad thing, because everything really is where you want it. The gear lever is almost no distance from the wheel. The wheel itself is just a little bit smaller feeling than in the 996, and I do get the sensation of having a little bit more air around it. Anyone that's driven one of those earlier cars will probably have noticed that the wheel seems to get weirdly close to your legs. You just don't have that much room in the car. Here, they've improved it, despite the fact it isn't actually any bigger. Yes, elements of it are now laughably out of date, chiefly the infotainment system here that when new was very, very fancy. The idea of having to put a SIM card into your car was, well, that was space age. The 997 also brought back the concept of a Carrera 2S, which had existed previously in the 993, but not the 996, where you only got a Carrera 4S. Also coming back to the 911 was the idea of different engine sizes in your base models. So the regular Carrera got a 320-ish horsepower, 3.6 litre naturally aspirated flat six. The Carrera S got a slightly larger 3.8 litre, making 355 horsepower. Torque here is 295 pound-feet, that's 400 Newton-meters. Transmission option was either this beautiful, short-throw, very direct and highly enjoyable 6-speed manual, or the somewhat more antiquated 5-speed Tiptronic. No prizes for guessing which my preference is. That being said, I am always grateful that Porsche were a company to offer automatic options in their sports cars, because though the comment section is always full of people going, "If you can't drive a manual, you don't deserve to have a sports car," I think it's very easy to forget there are a lot of people out there who desperately would like to drive a manual but are physically unable to. So offering something for them, I think, is always a very good thing. This car also has PASM adaptive dampers, which at the time was still a very newfangled and interesting thing to see, not the common item that they are today. You've still got some classic old school options like the sunroof, love that, and this car really does offer you just about everything you'd need in a sports car. Storage space up the front is reasonable, if not amazing, but more than enough, I would say, for daily duties and the odd trip away. Of course, classic 911, you've got little back seats that are not really all that much good to most people, but if you have kids, they will fit in there. Or, as we found out on the way home from Stuttgart, if you drop the rear of the seats down, you're left with a space that is conveniently the precise size to fit a crate of beer. Now that's German engineering. The 997 also did something else entirely unthinkable. It was actually cheaper than the old one. In 1999, Dad had bought a 996 C4, brand new. 5 years later, he put the order in for this. The differences really were the fact that this was a C2S versus a C4, and the C4 was a Tiptronic, which he admitted was a mistake. This one he got in a manual. The 997, despite being a later car with more toys, more powerful, technically speaking a trim level up, was actually quite a bit cheaper. I can't think of that happening now. And you know something? It doesn't really take very long at all to work out why Duncan has held onto this car for quite so long. It is a brilliant thing, so well judged and so very well suited to British roads, which is not something I can say of all of the modern 911s. Those have grown considerably, and that really is one of the chief reasons why he's never felt the need to upgrade. In truth, this car already has plenty of power for this kind of road. 355 horses may not sound all that much. Indeed, many a hot hatch owner would now be positively upset if their car made that little. But reality is, in a 1500 odd kilo car, it is enough. The throttle response is absolutely beautiful. The noise is decent, though this doesn't have the sports exhaust. In fact, there were only two options that Dad wanted on his car that he couldn't have because he'd ordered one of the first. One was the sports exhaust, the other was red seat belts. He later tried to get a sports exhaust for it, but then they quoted him a price that made him choke on his dinner. So he said, "No, I'll keep the one that I've got, thank you very much." Naturally, if you do want your 997 to sound a little bit more raucous, there are now many options available to you. The red line in this car is not stratospheric, just over 7,000, but it's more than enough, and it has decent pull all the way through the rev range. In fact, like the old 996, it's the mid-range where it feels its strongest. Many people, particularly on the internet, will always talk about how great it is to have a Banzai high-revving engine, but the fact is, that's not really where you spend a lot of your time. Having a bit of extra mid-range poke is always a good thing. The suspension is really well damped. In fact, this is one of the very few cars where, when pressing on, I will actually engage the sport mode, because without it, the car does move around quite a bit more than you might expect. It is actually rather enjoyable and really does remind me of the 911s of old. And then we get to the most important part of any 911, the steering. This is wonderful. Not the best, I would say, I've ever experienced, and perhaps not even the best in 997s that I've experienced. The early 996s also are just that much better, and I do say early because that's important. The pre-facelift cars, the late 90s ones, those are incredible. Some of the best steering you will ever experience. This is still not bad, far from it, but it's got just that little bit of softness around it. It feels like it's wearing a woolly jumper. It's just got the edge taken off. This really isn't too much of a bad thing, and crucially, all of the key traits of 911 steering are present and correct. It moves around in your hand, it waits up in the corners, it talks to you, it's alive. The car itself is also perfectly sized for just about any scenario. You've still got a view of those headlights out the front. It feels like a really, really narrow thing. If you step into this from a 992, say, it's like jumping back 30 or 40 years rather than the nearly 20 that it actually is. The only real criticism I have of this particular example is a couple of the bushes have gone a little bit creaky, but that is a very, very common 996 and 997 thing. You may have spotted the odd cobweb on this car, and that's because it spends most of its life in dry storage, where it's away from the rain, but not from the eight-legged terrors. It is at this point where I am very, very glad not to live in Australia, because if one of those great big things I've seen on the telly were to walk out of the steering wheel, I would scream like a girl and then set the car on fire just to be sure. So then, as you can probably tell, after 17 years of waiting, the 997 C2S is not a disappointment. What then are you going to pay to get into one of these? Well, that's where it gets interesting. These were, like 996s, very cheap. They're not quite as cheap, but they also haven't gone up as much as just about everything else seems to have over the last year. So, a cheap example of one of these is going to set you back about 22 or 23 grand. What is particularly interesting about that is the fact that a 997 C2, not S, will set you back about the same. This might have something to do with the fact that though these cars don't suffer quite so much from the dreaded IMS as the 996, they did suffer fairly badly from bore scoring. In fact, the 997.1 C2S of all of the Porsche products seem to get that the worst. This puts a lot of people off. Personally, I wouldn't be too worried about it, because that's something you can relatively easily inspect for, make sure your car doesn't have, and then you can buy fairly safely. In truth, what I would do if I was going to buy one of these is get one maybe that was already knackered, take it to Hartech, get them to work their engine magic, oversize the engine a little bit. I think they can take these to 4.1 litres. That'll give you just a little bit more power and torque and not ruin the car, but add to the enjoyment and excitement. And though that won't be a cheap thing, it's probably 12, 13 grand or so, when you come to sell it, you're likely to get a lot of your money back, because then what you'll have will be a very desirable 997 with their one key issue all sorted. Brake feel is very similar to that in the 996, so the pedal's a little bit squishier than you might expect. Oh, that rear is wonderful, grip is decent, but the car moves around a little bit more than the modern stuff does. You feel confident to play with it. And the thing is, the 997.2 did in some ways improve things. The engine didn't have the problems that these did, but I also don't think they had the character that these did. Oh, you lean on it, you feel every little bit of texture and detail coming through the chassis. This is wonderful. Even weirder, if we were to call this, let's just say, 25 to 30 grand, get you into a really nice one of these. Well, that's less than what a lot of people seem to be paying now for a good E46 M3. And oh yes, that car has a bigger boot, bigger rear seats, and is also a very, very well-loved performance icon. This was more expensive when new, feels the more expensive car, drives so much better, so much better. I'm personally of the belief that the E46 M3 is criminally overrated, and people are very welcome to bring me theirs and try and prove me wrong, but I've owned one and driven a number of others, and thus far none of them really made me go, yeah, wow, this is a fabulous car. Yes, you can get it to do amazing drifty slidey stuff, but you can do that in an MX-5 as well, so I've never really sort of seen the appeal. I love the E46 as it happens, but the M3 I feel is just overrated. At some point in the future, I'm sure people will realise that these are criminally undervalued and they probably should be charging a lot more. After all, if you can look yourself in the mirror and ask 35 or 40 grand for an E46 M3 that's not a CSL, there's no reason these shouldn't command similar money, because I think they're a better car. If you're the sort of person that thinks a bigger engine in a car sounds fantastic, you'll also be delighted to know that there is a wealth of aftermarket parts available for these, so you can customize and personalize them to your tastes. Chuck a few £1,000s at one of these and I think they make a much better track car than an M3 too. Anyway, that's enough from me. A huge thank you to Duncan for bringing his car out. Thanks as ever to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already to both this channel and my new one, JayEmm and Friends, started by myself and my buddy Anthony, where we talk about not just car stuff, but a whole load of other things too. We'd really appreciate your support if you can subscribe to both. And in any case, I hope to see you for the next one. Bye-bye.